Staff Sergeant Ray Hyland had already pulled the cowling panels twice that morning. The big Pratt & Whitney on Lieutenant William Yukeim's P-47 had been running rough at idle, a faint miss that no one could pin to a single cylinder, and Hyland wanted it sorted before the briefing let out. He tightened the last Zeus fastener, wiped his hands on a rag that hadn't been cleaned since Tuesday, and stepped back as the pilots came walking across the hardstand at Halesworth in a loose knot of leather and Mae Wests. December in Suffolk, 1943, meant the grass stayed wet all day, and the overcast sat on the field like a dirty wool blanket. Yukeim climbed the wing, dropped into the cockpit, and Hyland helped him with the shoulder harness. Nothing unusual, no premonition. The Thunderbolt's engine caught on the first try, settled into that deep radial throb that shook your ribs if you stood too close, and Yukeim gave a thumbs up through the canopy glass. Hyland stepped off the wing and watched the big fighter waddle toward the perimeter track, its tail wheel cutting a dark line through the frost. He'd see the airplane again in a few hours. He was wrong about that. The 56th Fighter Group had been operational from Halesworth since July, and by December, they'd already built a reputation that Luftwaffe units along the Channel coast tracked with professional and increasingly personal attention. Hub Zemke's outfit flew the heaviest single-engine fighter in the European theater, a 7-ton Republic P-47D that could absorb punishment that would have shredded a Spitfire and keep grinding forward. The Germans called it the Donnerbolt, a play on Thunderbolt, and they respected it without loving it. What they hadn't yet accounted for, what no tactical manual on either side addressed, was the specific kind of American who'd fly one of those things into a head-on merge with empty guns and decide that ramming, physically colliding with the enemy aircraft at 22,000 feet, beat the alternative of letting a German go home. That morning's mission put Yukeim's flight over the German coast as part of a bomber escort sweep, the kind of job the 56th had been grinding through since the autumn. Somewhere above the cold coast, his .850 caliber Brownings ran dry. And what happened next sits in an after-action report at the National Archives, a couple of paragraphs that read like someone describing a car accident rather than one of the most aggressive acts of air combat in the 8th Air Force's war. If stories like this matter to you, if you think the men who flew these missions deserve more than a filing cabinet in College Park, Maryland, hit subscribe, leave a like, and drop in the comments any 56th Fighter Group connections you have. Crew chief, pilot, anyone. These names shouldn't stay buried in carbon copy paperwork. Now, 22,000 feet above the German coast, a Luftwaffe pilot, whose name does not appear in the American records, had problems of his own. He flew a Messerschmitt Bf-109G, the Gustav model, which by late '43 carried a nose-mounted 20mm MG, 151 cannon, and two 13mm machine guns synchronized through the propeller arc. A capable airplane, flown by a pilot who'd probably survived long enough to understand that the American escort fighters showing up in growing numbers over the Reich represented something more durable than a temporary nuisance. The German had likely engaged before. He understood closure rates. He understood the geometry of a head-on pass, where two fighters approaching each other at a combined speed north of 600 miles per hour had roughly 2 seconds of effective firing time before one of them broke. What he did not understand, could not have understood, was that the Thunderbolt boring in on him carried no ammunition. 0 rounds across all 8 guns. The American looked exactly like a fighter committed to a firing pass, because that's exactly how Yukeim flew it. Nose on, wings level, no flinch. The German held his own line. He had cannon rounds after all, and fired, at the range where a sane pilot in Yukeim's position would have broken, rolled, dove, done anything to convert empty guns into separation and speed. The P-47 kept coming. The FMS series contains a Luftwaffe officer's post-war reflection on American aggressiveness that fits this moment almost too neatly. He described the American fighter pilot's willingness to press attacks to weights and ranges that seemed irrational, and attributed it not to recklessness, but to a confidence in the aircraft that bordered on faith. Bordered on faith. A German officer chose those words, sitting in a room with American intelligence personnel, trying to explain something that still clearly unsettled him years after the war ended. The collision at 22,000 feet happened faster than either pilot could have narrated it. Yuchheim's propeller and engine cowling struck the Messerschmitt somewhere aft of the cockpit. The exact geometry stays ambiguous in the report, and both aircraft came apart in ways their designers never stress-tested for. The German fighter broke up. Yuchheim's Thunderbolt, missing most of its propeller and a significant portion of its forward fuselage, did something that a Spitfire or a Mustang almost certainly could not have done. It kept flying, badly, shaking itself half to death, hemorrhaging oil and hydraulic fluid into the freezing air. But the R2800 Radial, that massive 18-cylinder engine Republic, had bolted to the front of every Thunderbolt, had enough metal between the impact point and the pilot to act as an unintended battering ram and an accidental shield. To understand why Yuchheim survived, and why the Thunderbolt made survival even theoretically possible, we have to go back to a factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, and an engineering philosophy that every German pilot eventually encountered, whether he understood it or not. The main spar of a P-47's wing ran through the fuselage like a steel backbone, a single forged beam that carried the loads of every maneuver, every dive pullout, every hard landing on a wet English runway. Republic's engineers specified it heavier than it needed to be. They specified almost everything heavier than it needed to be. And that decision, repeated across 10,000 individual components, produced an airplane that weighed more than most twin-engine fighters of 1939 and flew anyway because the engine bolted to the front generated enough horsepower to drag all that metal through the sky at 400 miles per hour. Farmingdale sat on Long Island's south shore, close enough to the ocean that salt air corroded tooling if maintenance crews didn't stay ahead of it. Republic Aviation had been building fighters there since the late 30s, first under the Seversky name, then under Alexander Kartveli's design leadership after the corporate reorganization. Kartveli, a Georgian émigré who'd studied at the École Supérieure d'Aéronautique in Paris, carried a specific conviction about fighter design that put him at odds with almost every other major aircraft designer in the Allied world. The British at Supermarine and Hawker built around the lightest possible airframes. The Germans at Messerschmitt did the same. Kartveli built around the engine. Start with the biggest, most powerful radial available, wrap the minimum necessary airframe around it, and accept the weight penalty because horsepower solved problems that clever aerodynamics couldn't. The R2800 double wasp that Pratt & Whitney delivered to Farmingdale displaced 2,800 cubic inches, roughly the displacement of two automobile engines stacked together, and produced 2,000 horsepower in its wartime variants. 18 cylinders arranged in two radial rows, each cylinder about the size of a coffee can, air-cooled by precise baffling that directed ram air across the fin surfaces at calculated velocities. The whole assembly weighed north of 2,400 pounds before you added the propeller, the reduction gearbox, the accessory section, or the turbocharger ducting that snaked back through the belly of the fuselage to a General Electric unit mounted behind the pilot. So why does any of this matter to a lieutenant with empty guns at 22,000 feet? Because the engine sat in front of the pilot like a cast-iron wall. 2,400 pounds of forged steel, aluminum cylinder heads, magnesium accessory housings, and the heavy steel crankshaft running down the center, all of it forward of the firewall, all of it between the pilot's chest and whatever he flew into. A Merlin-powered fighter, the Mustang, the Spitfire, carried its engine in a long, narrow inline configuration that concentrated mass along a thin axis. A hit from any angle except dead ahead could reach the pilot through gaps in the engine block. The double wasp presented a circular cross-section, nearly 4 feet in diameter, a disc of metal. Republic's engineering team didn't design it as armor. They designed it as a power plant. The armor part came free. Kartveli's team also ran 8 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns through the wings, 4 per side, with ammunition feeds that held roughly 400 rounds per gun. 3,200 rounds total. The weight of that ammunition alone exceeded 350 pounds before you counted the guns themselves, The feed chutes, the heating ducts that kept the actions from freezing at altitude, and the pneumatic charging systems. Every pound went into the wings, which meant Republic had to build those wings strong enough to carry the load through 6G pullouts without buckling. Stronger wings meant heavier wings. Heavier wings meant a heavier fuselage to match. The whole airplane gained weight in a spiral that most designers would have interrupted with a compromise somewhere. Kartveli didn't interrupt it. The production floor at Farmingdale ran on 3 shifts by mid-43. Republic employed over 20,000 workers, a significant percentage of them women who'd never touched a rivet gun before, 1942, and now drove them with a speed that would have impressed a peacetime airframe mechanic. The plant turned out roughly 100 P-47s per month by the end of that year, a number that climbed past 400 per month when the Evansville, Indiana facility came fully online. Evansville alone, a factory built on farmland in southern Indiana, eventually produced more Thunderbolts than Farmingdale. The two plants combined delivered over 15,000 airframes before the war ended. 15,000 copies of an airplane that weighed 7 tons loaded and could survive structural damage that would have killed anything else in the inventory. An odd detail that goes nowhere, but keeps nagging at me. Republic's quality control logs, from 43, mention a recurring issue with the Zeus fasteners on the lower cowling panels, the same fasteners Highland tightened that morning at Halesworth. The supplier had changed the heat treatment on a batch, and the quarter-turn locks wouldn't seat properly in cold weather. Suffolk in December qualified as cold weather. The records don't say whether Yukeim's airplane carried fasteners from the bad batch. They wouldn't. What the records do confirm is the structural test data Republic ran on the P-47 airframe at their Farmingdale facility. Static load tests crushed the wing to failure at 12 Gs, twice the operational limit. Fuselage sections held pressures well beyond any combat scenario the engineers anticipated. They tested for bullet impacts, cannon shell fragments, flak damage. They never tested for what happens when you fly the airplane into another airplane at a combined closure speed approaching 700 miles per hour. Nobody tests for that. Yukeim ran the experiment himself, and the only reason he lived to file the paperwork traces straight back to that factory on Long Island, and a Georgian engineer who refused to build a light airplane. Hub Zemke pinned a map of northwestern Germany to the briefing room wall at Halesworth and drew a circle around Bremen with a grease pencil. The circle meant nothing tactically. Bremen's flak defenses didn't care about grease pencil, but it told his pilots where the bombers would be thickest and where the Luftwaffe would come up hardest. Zemke briefed every mission the same way. Find the enemy, close the distance, shoot him down. If he runs, chase him. If he turns into you, don't flinch first. That last part sounds like bravado. It wasn't. Zemke had built the 56th Fighter Group from a training unit into the highest-scoring fighter outfit in the 8th Air Force through a method that looked reckless from the outside, but followed an internal logic as rigid as anything the Luftwaffe's own tactical schools produced. The difference sat in the assumptions. German fighter doctrine in 43 still emphasized the bounce, altitude advantage, surprise, a single high-speed pass, then extension away from the fight before the enemy could react. Clean, efficient, survivable. Zemke's doctrine started from a different premise entirely. The Americans had more airplanes. They had more pilots. They had a factory system that could replace both at a rate the Germans couldn't match, and, here's the part that mattered at 22,000 feet, the P-47 could absorb damage that sent a 109 or a Focke-Wulf into the ground. So Zemke's standing order amounted to this: stay in the fight, don't disengage. Press the attack until one of you is finished, because the math favors us and it does not favor them. How did that translate to an individual pilot sitting in a 7-ton fighter with frozen fingers and a gun sight full of Messerschmitt? New pilots in the 56th absorbed it within their first week at Halesworth, usually from men who'd already survived 10 or 15 missions, and spoke about combat the way a mechanic speaks about engine timing. Practical, specific, stripped of drama. You close to 200 yards before firing. Not 300, not 250, 200, where the convergence pattern of 850 calibers created a cone of bullets roughly the size of a barn door, and missing became harder than hitting. The Germans fired at longer ranges. They had cannon, which gave them effective reach, and their training emphasized conservation of ammunition and controlled bursts. Zemke's pilots emptied their guns in seconds. 400 rounds per gun at a cyclic rate of 800 rounds per minute meant each Browning ran dry in 30 seconds of continuous fire. In practice, pilots fired in bursts of 2 to 4 seconds. At 200 yards, those bursts shredded airframes. The approach terrified replacement pilots who trained at fields in Connecticut and Florida, where instructors taught gunnery against towed targets at comfortable distances. The 56th retrained them in the air over Suffolk, and the ones who couldn't adjust to the closing distances washed out or died early. Zemke didn't soften the standard. He couldn't afford to. Every pilot who broke off an engagement early let a German fighter live to hit a B-17 on the next pass, and the bombers couldn't take many more losses before someone in Washington started asking whether strategic daylight bombing worked at all. The group's leading aces embodied the doctrine so completely that their individual records read like case studies in controlled violence. Robert Johnson, who'd finished the war with 27 confirmed kills, flew engagements where his own aircraft absorbed 20mm cannon hits and kept fighting. On one mission, his Thunderbolt took a burst that jammed the canopy shut, shattered instruments across the panel, and left hydraulic fluid pooling under his seat. Johnson stayed in the fight, not because he didn't notice, because the airplane still flew and his gun still worked, and there were still Germans in front of him. Francis Gabreski, who'd eventually surpassed Johnson's score, operated on the same principle. The engagement ends when the enemy is destroyed, or you physically cannot continue. No third option. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey's post-war interrogation files contain a Jagdgeschwader officer's assessment of American fighter tactics over the Reich that captures what this felt like from the receiving end. He told his interrogators that the American escort fighters did not behave as fighters in the traditional sense. They behaved as if each pilot had been ordered to die rather than allow a bomber to fall. The officer meant it as a criticism of tactical flexibility. He failed to grasp that inflexibility on that specific point constituted the entire strategy. Zemke wanted pilots who'd rather collide with you than let you through to the bomber stream. Which brings us back to Yuchheim, who ran out of ammunition and did not disengage. A pilot trained under different doctrine, British, German, even another American fighter group with a less aggressive culture, might have reasonably turned for home. Empty guns meant you couldn't contribute. The mission, tactically speaking, had ended. Yuchheim had spent months absorbing a different calculation. He knew the Messerschmitt in front of him carried cannon rounds. He knew that 109 could roll off this engagement and put those rounds into a B-17 fuselage full of 10 Americans who had no way to dodge. And he knew, because Zemke's pilots talked about this openly, the way athletes talk about acceptable pain, that the P-47 he sat in weighed twice what the German fighter weighed and carried an engine block in front of his chest that amounted to the heaviest piece of armor any fighter pilot in the war ever hid behind. The choice between ramming and disengaging looked different when you sat behind 2,400 pounds of radial engine and your commanding officer had spent 6 months telling you that the only unforgivable act in the 56th Fighter Group involved letting a German go home alive. I had nothing left to shoot with, so I decided to use the airplane. That line doesn't appear in any official document. It's a paraphrase, passed through decades of 56th Fighter Group reunions and squadron lore until nobody can pin it to a specific interview or letter. The after-action report itself uses language so flat it almost hides what happened, but the sequence it describes, stripped of bureaucratic tone and laid out in order, tells you everything about what Yuchheim did and why the German pilot on the receiving end never had a chance to adapt. The ammunition counter isn't precise. 8 guns, roughly 400 rounds each, 3,200 total, though some pilots reported loads closer to 3,400, depending on the armorer's count and whether the belts seated fully in the feed trays. Call it 3,200 and change. At the firing distances Zemke's pilots preferred, those rounds disappeared fast. 2-second bursts across 8 guns consumed over 400 rounds. Yuchheim had engaged multiple targets during the escort sweep. The mission report references at least 2 firing passes before the guns went dry, and the last burst produced that distinctive clatter of bolts cycling on empty chambers, a sound every fighter pilot in the war recognized instantly. The guns didn't taper off. They stopped. One moment you commanded a wall of 50 caliber fire that could saw a wing off a bomber at 200 yards. The next moment, you sat in a very expensive, very heavy glider with a propeller on the front. Most pilots who ran dry at altitude pulled up, checked their 6, and pointed the nose toward England. Standard procedure, the sensible move, and the one that kept you alive. Yuchheim held his heading. The Messerschmitt he'd been tracking, and here the report gets maddeningly thin on details, occupied a position ahead and slightly below, either setting up for a pass on the bomber formation or maneuvering after its own engagement. The German pilot could see the Thunderbolt. He'd have recognized the silhouette immediately. That blunt radial nose and the wide elliptical wings looked nothing like a Spitfire or a twin-engine Lightning. Every Jagdgeschwader unit on the Channel coast had identification charts pinned to their ready room walls, and the P-47's profile dominated the American section by late '43. He knew what sat behind him. What he could not know, from any visual cue available at combat distance, involved the state of its ammunition. A P-47 with full guns and a P-47 with empty guns looked identical from the outside. Same profile and engine note, same aggressive closure. The gun ports in the wing leading edges gave no indication. They sat flush, small dark circles that revealed nothing about the belts behind them. The only way to determine whether the American had ammunition involved, letting him shoot at you, which, if he did have ammunition, solved the question in a way you wouldn't survive to contemplate. This ambiguity worked entirely in Yuchheim's favor, and he exploited it the way Zemke had trained his pilots to exploit every asymmetry the Thunderbolt offered. He pushed the throttle forward. The R-2800 responded the way 2,800 cubic inches of supercharged radial engine responds, immediately and with authority. At 22,000 feet, the turbocharger maintained sea-level manifold pressure, which meant Yuchheim had the full 2,000 horsepower available even in thin air. The Thunderbolt accelerated. 7 tons of Republic steel and Pratt & Whitney iron, closing the distance on a 4-ton Messerschmitt whose pilot now faced a tactical problem he'd never trained for. The American fighter behind him displayed every characteristic of an attack run. Nose down, wings level, closing fast, but produced no tracers, no muzzle flash, no sound of bullets punching aluminum. The silence of those 8 gun ports contained information the German pilot couldn't process in time. Did he see Yuchheim closing? Almost certainly. Rear visibility from a Bf-109G cockpit, rated poor by any standard. The armored headrest and the canopy framing created blind spots that Luftwaffe pilots complained about throughout the war, but a Thunderbolt filling your rearward quarter at decreasing range would have registered in peripheral vision or a mirror check. The FMS reports include German assessments of the P-47's diving speed that consistently note surprise at how fast the heavy fighter accelerated in a descent. One officer used the word erschreckend, frightening, to describe watching a Thunderbolt close from astern. At 22,000 feet, with Yuchheim pushing the nose down slightly to build speed, the closure rate climbed past 50 miles per hour of overtake. The German had seconds. The sky at that altitude in December over the North Sea coast carried a pale gray quality, not overcast exactly, but a washed brightness that flattened depth perception and made range estimation unreliable. Contrails from the bomber formation streaked the air above. The cold at 22,000 feet hit 40 below zero, a temperature where exposed skin freezes in under a minute and the metal of a control stick numbs your fingers through leather gloves. Yuchheim felt none of that. Adrenaline performs its own kind of insulation. His world had narrowed to the Messerschmitt's tail section, growing larger in his windscreen. The horizontal stabilizer, the small rudder, the squared-off wingtips of the Gustav model resolving from a silhouette into an airplane with rivets and panel lines and paint chips along the leading edge. He didn't aim for the cockpit. The report suggests the point of impact fell aft of the German pilot's position, somewhere along the fuselage spine behind the canopy. Whether Yuchheim chose that geometry deliberately, or whether the German jinked at the last fraction of a second, pushing the impact point rearward, the records simply do not say. The collision itself occupied less than a tenth of a second, 636. That's the number of recorded Terran attacks Soviet pilots executed between 1941 and 1945. Deliberate ramming of enemy aircraft documented in unit records across every front from Murmansk to Sevastopol. The tactic predated Barbarossa. Soviet flight manuals included it as a last resort option as early as the late 30s, codified in training doctrine, with diagrams showing optimal angles of impact against bomber formations. A pilot who survived a Terran received the Hero of the Soviet Union decoration almost automatically. Many didn't survive. The arithmetic favored death. An I-16 ramming a Heinkel 111 at combined speeds often disintegrated both aircraft, and the Soviet pilot's odds of bailout depended on factors: loss of consciousness, structural collapse of his own cockpit, altitude remaining, that stacked against him brutally. The word Taran itself comes from the Russian for battering ram, which traces back through medieval siege terminology to the naval rams of classical antiquity. The Soviets applied it to aerial combat with a directness that unsettled even their German opponents. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from the Eastern Front reference ramming attacks with a tone that wavers between contempt and unease. Contempt because the tactics seemed primitive, unease because it worked, and because it signaled an opponent who traded self-preservation for mission completion in a way that made standard evasive doctrine irrelevant. You can outfly a bullet. You cannot outfly a man who's decided his airplane is the bullet. But the distinction matters. The Soviet Terran grew from a specific soil, obsolete equipment, limited ammunition, sometimes no ammunition at all, flown by pilots with 40 hours of flight training against an enemy fielding the best fighters in the world in June 41. Ramming wasn't courage alone. It expressed desperation systematized into doctrine. A nation that couldn't build enough good fighters fast enough, telling its pilots to use their bodies as weapons because the alternative involved watching the motherland burn. By 43 and 44, as Soviet industry recovered and Yak-9s and Lav-5s reached the front in numbers, Terran attacks declined sharply. When pilots had guns that worked and airplanes that could compete, they stopped ramming. The correlation tells you everything about what the tactic actually meant. On the German side, the Rammjäger concept arrived even later and stank even more of desperation. Sonderkommando Elba launched its single-mast ramming attack on April 7, 1945, less than a month before surrender, sending stripped-down 109s against American bomber formations with instructions to ram after expending their limited ammunition. The pilots volunteered. Some had ideological fervor, others had nothing left. Heinrich Erler, a Knight's Cross holder with 204 victories who'd been court-martialed for failing to intercept bombers over the Tirpitz, flew an Me-262 into a B-17 formation that same spring and never came back. His last radio transmission reportedly said something about having used his ammunition and now going in with the rest of the aircraft. Whether those exact words left his mouth or got polished in retelling, the gesture itself read as atonement. A disgraced officer choosing death over continued shame in a war already lost. Valhalla logic. The Norse fatalism that threaded through certain corners of Luftwaffe culture, particularly among the old guard who'd watched their service go from conquering Europe to defending rubble. Anyway, neither of those traditions explains Yuchheim. He flew an airplane that could survive the impact. He knew it could survive the impact, not with certainty, but with the kind of informed confidence that comes from watching your squadron mates bring home Thunderbolts missing chunks of wing, trailing oil from shattered cylinder jugs, landing with bent propeller blades and holes in the fuselage you could fit your fist through. The P-47 came home. That fact sat in every pilot's mind as a baseline assumption. reinforced by each mission where the airplane absorbed punishment that killed Spitfires and Mustangs and 109s. Yuchheim didn't ram the Messerschmitt expecting to die. He rammed it expecting to win, expecting the 7 tons of Republic iron behind him to do what Republic's engineers had built it to do, which involved absorbing forces that exceeded rational design parameters and continuing to function. The impact sheared the Messerschmitt's fuselage aft of the cockpit. The German fighter broke in two. Whether the pilot ejected, whether he had time to grab the canopy release, whether the structural failure killed him before aerodynamic forces could, sources conflict, and the after-action report from Yuchheim's side records only that the 109 went down and no parachute appeared. One aircraft, split at the spine, tumbling toward the North Sea in 2 separate pieces trailing fuel vapor and aluminum fragments that caught the pale December light on their way down. Yuchheim's propeller bent. His engine cowling crumpled inward. Oil pressure dropped. The R-2800 kept running, damaged, shaking, losing oil, but running, because 18 cylinders don't quit simultaneously unless you break the crankshaft, and the crankshaft sat deep inside that 4-foot disc of metal that had just punched through a German airplane. He had altitude. Power remained, diminishing but present. And he had a heading for England that every 8th Air Force pilot memorized before breakfast: 270 magnetic, and keep the channel beneath you until the white cliffs appear. The Thunderbolt descended. Not a dive, a controlled letdown, losing altitude in exchange for distance, the damaged engine protesting through vibrations. Yuchheim felt through the stick, through the rudder pedals, through the seat of his pants, where the airframe's structural frequency transmitted directly into his spine. 22,000 feet to 10,000, 10,000 to 5. The English coast materialized ahead, gray-green and flat. The Suffolk shoreline he'd left 90 minutes earlier, from a different altitude and a different state of mind. He crossed in over Southwold at roughly 3,000 feet, with his oil temperature pegged and smoke beginning to trail from the lower cowling. Those same panels Hyland had fastened that morning, now buckled and leaking. The man who used his airplane as a weapon lost his war to an American airplane coming the other direction. May 28, 1944, 6 months after the ramming over Bremen. Yuchheim had kept flying, kept closing to 200 yards and bringing damaged Thunderbolts back to Halesworth with new holes for Hyland to patch. The 56th Fighter Group had transitioned through the winter and spring of '44 into the most aggressive escort outfit in the European theater, and Yuchheim fit the culture the way a round fits a chamber. He'd proven something over Bremen that most pilots never get asked to prove, and the proof had settled into him quietly. No swagger. The after-action report from December sat in a filing cabinet somewhere, and squadron mates knew the story, and that sufficed. Then, a P-51B came through his windscreen. Not literally, but close enough that the distinction matters only to the maintenance crews who sorted the wreckage afterward. The mission put the 56th over France, deep escort work ahead of the invasion buildup that every pilot in England could feel accelerating through May. The details of how an American Mustang and an American Thunderbolt ended up on a head-on collision course at combat speed occupy a gap in the records that nobody filled with satisfying clarity. Friendly fire incidents in the 8th Air Force ran higher than official narratives preferred to acknowledge. The theater identification officer's reports from 44 document dozens of cases where American fighters engaged American fighters, sometimes fatally, in the confusion of swirling dogfights where silhouette recognition failed and trigger discipline evaporated at the speeds involved. The P-51B, with its squared-off wing planform and inline engine, looked nothing like a 109 from the side. From directly head-on, at closure rates exceeding 600 miles per hour combined, the differences compressed into a dark dot growing larger for roughly 2 seconds before physics removed all options. The collision destroyed both aircraft. The Mustang pilot's fate stays absent from the record's Yuchheim's file references, whether he survived, whether he bailed out, whether the impact killed him instantly. That file holds a gap shaped like a man, and nobody filled it. Yuchheim's Thunderbolt, his second war-ending Thunderbolt, if you count the one he'd flown home smoking over Southwold, broke apart with enough warning or enough structural delay for him to get out. He went over the side somewhere above France at an altitude the report doesn't specify, pulled his ripcord, and felt the chute deploy above him in a jolt that cracked through his harness straps and snapped his head forward. A parachute over-occupied France in May. 44 hung in the sky like a signal flare. Every German unit within visual range could see the white canopy against whatever gray or blue the French sky offered that morning, and a descending pilot moved at roughly 15 feet per second, slow enough to track, slow enough to lead with a gun sight, slow enough to kill with a rifle from the ground if you felt like it. The Geneva Convention prohibited firing on parachuting aircrew. The Luftwaffe's official position endorsed the prohibition. Individual pilots, by 44, increasingly ignored it, particularly on the Western Front, where American bombing had flattened their cities and killed their families, where it had destroyed the industrial base that kept their own aircraft in the air. By 44, the prohibition meant nothing to a pilot whose house was rubble. A Bf-109 came around. The document uses language that suggests a deliberate strafing pass, not a momentary burst from a fighter already engaged in combat, but a controlled approach on a man dangling under silk. Yuchheim saw it coming. You see everything under a parachute. The horizon sits wide open in every direction. Your hands grip risers instead of a control stick, and the engine noise that's filled your skull for hours has been replaced by wind through nylon and the creak of harness webbing. Into that silence came the sound of a Daimler-Benz engine at high power, a distinctive liquid whine that sat an octave above the Thunderbolt's radial growl, and then the flicker of muzzle flash from the wing roots where the 109 carried its 20mm cannon. He took hits. The report confirms wounds, but not their precise nature or severity. Yuchheim reached the ground alive, which means the German pilot either missed with enough of his burst to leave the parachute functional and the man beneath it breathing, or made a single pass and didn't return for a second. Either way, the calculus lands somewhere between attempted murder and bad marksmanship. Yuchheim hit French soil wounded, tangled in his chute, and within hours fell into German hands. The man who'd rammed a Messerschmitt at 22,000 feet spent the rest of the war behind wire. He tried to leave 3 times. The escape attempts appear in his prisoner file with the compressed notation that POW records favor, dates, methods, recapture details stripped to their administrative bones. 3 tries says something about the man that the ramming incident already suggested. Yuchheim did not accept the current situation as permanent. The Germans moved him east as the front collapsed westward through the winter of 44 into 45, the long forced marches that killed weaker prisoners through exposure and starvation, while the Reich shrank around them. Liberation came in the spring of 45, American or Soviet forces reaching whatever camp held him last. The record thins to almost nothing here. A man who generated 2 extraordinary combat reports and 3 escape attempts vanishes into the mass of returning POWs processed through reception centers and discharge paperwork and train rides home. Highland, back at Halesworth, had built other Thunderbolts for other pilots after Yuchheim went down. The cowling panels still fastened the same way. The R2800 still ran rough at idle sometimes, a faint miss that could mean a fouled plug or a valve seat or nothing at all. The war didn't pause for one missing pilot. It never did. I cut his head off with my propeller. William Yuchheim said that at Columbus Air Force Base in 2011, 87 years old, standing in front of a room full of student pilots who'd never touched a propeller-driven airplane. The base had invited him as part of a heritage event, one of those ceremonies where the Air Force trots out its old men and hopes the young lieutenants absorb something that can't be taught in a simulator. Yuchheim delivered. That single sentence landed in the room like a brick through a window, and the pilots sitting in their flight suits with their energy drinks and their digital glass cockpits went very still. He wasn't bragging. The men who'd done the hardest things in that war almost never bragged. He stated it the way you'd describe changing a tire. something that needed doing, so he did it, and the tool he had available happened to weigh 7 tons and spin a 13-foot propeller at 1,600 RPM. The quote circulated afterward through Air Force channels, the way good stories do, retold at officer clubs, referenced in leadership briefings, eventually landing in print. It carries the compression of 68 years of living, with a memory that most people couldn't process in a lifetime. Yukaim had reduced the ramming, the damaged engine, the smoking flight home over the channel, the landing at Halesworth with Highland running toward the aircraft, reduced all of it to 7 words that contained the entire event the way a seed contains a tree. But the quote that mattered more, the one that pays off the premise of this entire story, never came from Yukaim at all. It came from the Germans. The FMS reports compiled after the war include Luftwaffe officers' assessments of American fighter tactics in the European theater, and the section addressing the P-47 reads like a grudging confession extracted under the weight of evidence. German pilots respected the Spitfire for its agility and feared the Mustang for its range. The Thunderbolt they described differently. The word that recurs across multiple accounts translates roughly as brutality. Not the brutality of the pilot, but the brutality of the machine itself, an aircraft that absorbed damage no single-engine fighter should survive, and kept attacking with a persistence that broke the tactical assumptions Luftwaffe Doctrine relied upon. One officer's assessment, filed through the U.S. Army Historical Division, noted that the P-47's willingness to press attacks at close range, closer than any rational calculation of risk should permit, created a psychological effect on German pilots disproportionate to the actual losses inflicted. The Americans flew as if the airplane could not be killed. The problem, from the German perspective, involved the uncomfortable fact that the airplane frequently proved them right. That assessment validates Yukaim's decision more precisely than any medal citation could. He rammed a Messerschmitt because the Thunderbolt's engineering permitted it, because Zemke's culture encouraged it, and because the specific arithmetic of mass, speed, and structural margin favored the American aircraft in a collision the way it favored the American aircraft in every other category that determined survival. The German pilot who died over Bremen that December morning in '43 collided not with one man's recklessness, but with an entire industrial civilization's answer to the question of how much airplane a single pilot needs. Republic built too much airplane. Pratt & Whitney built too much engine. The Army Air Forces loaded too many guns, too many rounds, too much armor plate, too much redundancy in every system that could carry it. Every excess compounded into a margin that Alexander Kartveli's engineers never intended for ramming, but that functioned, when the moment arrived, exactly as if they had. Yukaim came home from the war and stayed in Mississippi. He'd grown up there, enlisted from there, and returned to a state that had sent 35,000 men into the Army Air Forces alone, a number that sits in the National Archives without commentary, just names and serial numbers and next-of-kin addresses filling boxes that nobody opens anymore. He built a life in Columbus, raised a family. The wounds from the parachute strafing healed into scars he carried under his clothes, where student pilots at heritage events couldn't see them. The 3 escape attempts from German captivity became stories his children heard at kitchen tables, stripped of the cold and the fear, delivered with the same flat factuality he'd bring to Columbus AFB decades later. The Thunderbolt he'd flown home smoking over Southwold never flew again. Highland's maintenance records show the aircraft struck from inventory after the damage assessment. Republic could build new ones faster than depots could rebuild wrecked ones, which tells you something about American production capacity that the Germans understood only after the war ended and the numbers became available. Highland himself finished the war maintaining aircraft for pilots whose names filled different files, different cabinets, and different gaps in the record. He rotated home in '45. Yukaim spoke at Columbus AFB one more time after the 2011 event, addressing a smaller group. Student pilots again, younger faces in the same flight suits. The base photographer caught him standing next to a T-6 Texan parked on the ramp for the occasion. A training aircraft from an era adjacent to his own, its radial engine cowling curved in a way that rhymed faintly with the Thunderbolt's massive nose. His hand rested on the cowling. an old man touching warm metal in Mississippi sunlight, remembering an engine that shook itself apart over the North Sea and carried him home anyway. He lived in Columbus until 2014.